and welcome to Bad Theology Busted, where we challenge the dangerous theology of Christian Zionism in all the places that it hides. This is the podcast of the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism. My name is Dee, and I'm joined by my co-host and my friend, Jesse.
Thanks, Dee. Today, we've connected with our movement partners in South Africa. Joining us across a vast span of time zones, we are excited to bring Dr. Thandi Gamedze and Dr. Ntando Mlambo to the podcast. The ideas of land, space, and place are integral to the conversation around colonialism and settler-colonialism in the context of both South Africa and Palestine. In fact, Palestinians and South Africans have long shared a deep historical affinity as those on the receiving end of settler-colonial violence and apartheid. Nelson Mandela is in fact well known for his support of Palestinian freedom, most famously declaring, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." Also, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Canon Naim Atik, the founder of the Sabeel Palestinian Liberation Theology movement, who are both Anglican clergymen, were longtime friends and partners in the work of liberation, with Archbishop Tutu becoming the patron of the international Sabeel movement. And of course, I would be remiss in this conversation not to mention my own status as an American settler calling in from unceded Ohlone land, otherwise known as the California Bay Area.
If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be back after the break to talk with our guests in depth about the manifestations of Christian Zionism in South Africa.
Someone once said, in the beginning God created us in his own image, and since then we've been returning the favor. And I think today many reflect their own supremacy and prejudice on the character of God. We must call for justice and accountability. The church belongs in the streets. We must call for justice and accountability. This is the path forward. We see the image of Jesus in the children of Gaza. In every child pulled from under the rubble, we see the image of Jesus. We're trying to reclaim the dignity and worth of these precious people given to them by God, yet stripped by the empire and colonization. We must call for justice and accountability. The church belongs in the streets. We must call for justice and accountability. This is the path forward.
Dr. Thandi Gamedze is a South African educator, theologian, cultural worker, and poet based at the University of Western Cape's Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice as a senior researcher. Her doctoral research was transdisciplinary, bringing together the worlds of education and theology to better understand the church's role in upholding and challenging dominant power relations relating to race, gender, and class. Gamedze's interests include Black theology, liberation theology, social justice, education, and the arts, particularly poetry. She has broad experience working across multiple sites, including churches, universities, high schools, and community organizations. So thank you both for being with us today. Much as, in my context, Manifest Destiny served as an animating theology or ideology behind the settler-colonial conquest of North America, the Afrikaner Calvinists of South Africa, from what I understand, I'm not an expert, saw their settler-colonial project as a direct calling from God. Quote, "Not unlike the people of Israel in the Bible." Meanwhile, the colonial Zionist project has been absolutely catastrophic to the native Palestinians, while Christian Zionism has provided theological justification, financial capital, and political cover for decades of land confiscation, ethnic cleansing, settlement activity, apartheid, and, as we speak, ongoing genocide in the Holy Land. Dr. Thandi, can you describe for me the impact and role of settler-colonial theology in perpetuating Indigenous dispossession and racial injustice?
Thanks so much, Jessie, and thanks for having me here. It's good to be part of the podcast. Yeah, I think theology has been integral to South Africa's history of colonialism and apartheid in so many ways. So 1652, was the year that is kind of seen as the year that colonialism began, with the Dutch settlers coming to South Africa, settling in Cape Town, actually, where I'm based. And they first came as Cape Town was kind of going to be a sort of watering station for them, for the Dutch East India Company, as a kind of halfway point as they would go on to India and other places. And then they ended up settling in South Africa. And then South Africa has a long history, like many other settler-colonial spaces, of mission, significantly from Europe. And I think, as in many places, the connection between the missionary project and the settler-colonial project is very much overlapping. And so theology was a huge part of the settler-colonial imposition and the land grabs and the kind of ideologies of superiority. So you talked about the Afrikaner people. South Africa has a history of Dutch colonization as well as British colonization. The Dutch were the first to arrive, and then the British came after, and then it was kind of a tussle between the two for many years, for about 300 years or so. And then apartheid was instituted by the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, who were descendants of the Dutch, in 1948. So with the Afrikaans people, I think that's where there's a very significant overlap with what's going on in Palestine. And as you mentioned, Israel seeing themselves and being seen by many as God's chosen people. The Afrikaner people very much saw themselves in the same way. There's even a day called the Day of the Vow, which is a day on the 16th of December. It's no longer called that anymore. But there was this battle between the Afrikaner people and Indigenous people of the land, and the Afrikaner people won and killed many people, and they saw that as kind of confirmation of this vow or this covenant between them and God, and seeing themselves as God's chosen people. So all of these racialized hierarchies and this subjugation and oppression was very much theologically rooted, which I think is what was so key in sustaining it. I think Mitri Rahib's software, that it's a significant part of the software that upheld the realities of apartheid and settler colonialism. And I think you see it in so many ways, but maybe one example is in Cape Town, there's the first kind of colonial outpost is called the Castle of Good Hope. Ironically, Cape Town is known as the Cape of Good Hope because it was this watering station that offered nurture and nourishment and food so that these colonizers could go on to be refreshed as they did their violent work. But anyway, this castle is this space of thick walls and cannons in the walls, and in it there's spaces where enslaved people were kept. There's even a dungeon where enslaved people who had tried to escape would be kept and tortured. And then just across from this torture chamber is this chapel with this very ornate cross that's kind of decorating it or next to it. And so I think this is very emblematic of this deep relationship between the church, between theology, and these violent histories of dispossession, of removal, of murder of Indigenous people, of enslavement. These two have always gone very much hand in hand and continue to do so, I think, in various ways in our contemporary society. Maybe I'll just leave that there for now.
Dr. Ntando Mlambo is a lecturer at the University of South Africa. She has an interest in disruptive Christian history narratives and methodologies, as well as spatial justice through the land. Her PhD was in church history, focusing on researching historical land space actions in 3 congregations. She's the author of several book chapters and journal articles, including The Role of Black Theology in the Post-Apartheid Context of Landlessness and Spatial Injustice, a discussion on 1994 to 2021, which can be found in Liberating Black Theology, Emerging South African Voices. As mentioned earlier, space and place have great significance in conversations at the intersection of Palestine and South Africa. In the Liberating Black Theology anthology, the contributors weave a tapestry of conflicting socio-political narratives that still persist in South Africa today and offer valuable insights for navigating the complexities of the theological landscape. Ntando, as someone who specializes in models that disrupt dominant church narratives and spatial justice as it relates to land, can you tell us and our listeners about the connections, the similarities and the dissimilarities that you see between conflicting socio-political and theological narratives in South Africa and in Palestine?
Thank you. Thank you, Dee. Thank you, Jessie, Thandi, for this introduction. So for me, I think South Africa has a historical, socio-political, and theological narratives that are essentially intertwined. And Thandi mentioned a few of those. In South Africa, we see historically parts of the Old Testament have been interpreted in a way where one group, and we see that in history mostly as the Afrikaners, see themselves as God's chosen people in South Africa. And just connected with what Thandi just said around the Day of the Vow, that was part of the process of the Great Trek. And during the Great Trek, the English were holding on to the Cape, and there was essentially a fight and conflict between two colonial powers. And some of the more right-wing Afrikaners moved out of the Cape and started to do what they called a Great Trek, and started to use an Exodus hermeneutic or reading of the Bible, saying they're moving into a promised land for their own freedom. And that's where we see this battle of Blood River against the Zulu, which creates the Day of the Vow. And so this move entrenches this promised people reading, and it allows many foundational parts of Afrikanerism or the Afrikaner Empire to form. And it's also part of the apartheid logic, particularly the spatial logic. So it begins to form different legislative narratives as well that are based within that biblical reading to say, because we are this promised people, we have to create a sense of separate development. And there we see then decades of legislated land and spatial differences that are created. So then in this sense, we see this similarity to Palestine in the sense that the God's people narrative is forming what the law is saying around movement, around land, around ranking, around ethnicity. And then they also inform colonial settler narratives in Palestine. So settlers in the West Bank noting this natural deserving of the land due to their faith and ethnicity. And so we see those similarities between the two, those historical connections. I think the differences would be the histories that land us here. Although we have similar colonial figures that seem to show up, such as the UK in both narratives, we see different activities around how we get to stringent land legislature. In one place, we see it based around race, and race being the conceptual object we use to rank people through their land. In Palestine, we see it through ethnicity, but also the sense that a historical God's people is more cared for. So the differences is then the history that gets us to those legislative narratives. But I think I'll leave it there for now.
For those of us that are not as informed, I'm wondering if you can just tell us a bit about what the Great Trek actually was and the history behind it, because in our context, I am less familiar with what you mean. So can you just explain to us what exactly that was?
It's a movement, and it is based in this conflict with the British. So in essence, there's this tussle between the Dutch or the Afrikaner at this point and the British, and they start to move from the Cape, which is now called the Western Cape, moving northwards through what is now called the Free State, up into Gauteng and further north. And basically, they're making that move because they're wanting to gain freedom from what they see as a British danger, and they're moving into the north to claim further a land free from this conflict, which they have with another colonial partner. What's interesting is that the British, the Portuguese, and the Dutch were all tussling over the Cape before the Dutch settled there. And so it seems to be a long-held conflict between the two that is connected with capitalism, and the refreshment station being key for that, as well as these different ways of colonizing. So the Dutch and the British had different ways in different state churches, and that also led to some conflicts. So the Great Trek is basically that move of Afrikaner people, not all, but some, into the north.
I think what's also interesting here is this tussle between these colonial powers. And for a long time, the Brits were kind of in power. And in many ways, well, for various periods, the British were very domineering and oppressive towards the Afrikaner people. So this Exodus narrative, which is part of many contexts, liberation theologies, and then it also gets taken on by the Afrikaner people who, in relation to the Brits at that time, were the victims and the oppressed in this narrative. And this kind of victimhood narrative becomes very fundamental then for their own story of chosenness as well. And of course, in this, which is, I think, another parallel to the story of Israel and Palestine, the people that are totally erased from this victimhood narrative are, in South Africa, the Indigenous Black people of South Africa, who then become oppressed, who are being oppressed by these two colonial powers, and then become particularly oppressed by the Afrikaner people under apartheid. And then, of course, in the victimhood narrative of Israel, the people, and of course, the anti-Semitism in Germany, which then gets developed into the whole narrative, and who the people that get erased in that narrative and invisibilized are, of course, the Palestinians, who then become the actual victims, the next victims of this ongoing story. And so I think those parallels are also, I think, really important to note, because the way these theologies get used and perpetuated in a way that leaves blind spots which don't allow people to see who then becomes oppressed in these stories. And I think that's what's really important also about a lot of Palestinian liberation theology, because it calls out how many liberation theologies, by using the Exodus story without recognizing how then God's people go on to steal land and ethnically cleanse another people, it often gets erased in these liberation theology narratives. So I think, that's a really important part of the story as well, I guess.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was actually going to be my exact next question. You answered everything. Because I was going to ask about, I picked up immediately on using the Exodus narrative and how that's been so foundational to so many liberation theology movements, and just asking exactly how we need to be careful, I guess, because it has also led to so much repression and dispossession of others, precisely because if you're going to talk about Exodus, the next step is conquest. You're absolutely right. That's the genius, I think, of the Palestinian liberation theology push of you can't talk liberation without looking at the Canaanites and asking about their history. I'm monologuing. I'm supposed to be interviewing. You answered the question perfectly. I'm going to... Sorry.
But I think it raises such important questions about our blind spots and the importance of ongoing reflexivity to ensure that none of us are perpetuating the harm that we claim to be actually trying to push back against. And the director of the center that I work at, Sarojini Nada, has recently published a book called Gender, Genocide, Gaza, and the Book of Esther, something about texts of terrorism, and is basically kind of looking at the Book of Esther in this light. And the Book of Esther, I think, has been kind of spoken about by many feminists who've called out the ways that it perpetuates gender injustice in various ways. There's various layers. It is normalized and sacralized, and the readers and those who tell the story are often cheering and celebrating this genocide, and the horror kind of gets erased. And so I think it's very easy to develop these blind spots that allow us not to see when our victories are actually resulting in someone else's oppression. And I think having that constant reflexivity is so important in the way that we read these Bible stories, which I think have direct ties to the way that we read the world and the way that we see each other and God in the world.
Yeah, no, thank you. To bring it back maybe to some of our North American listeners, I'm reminded actually of the work of theologian Mark Charles, who, if you may be familiar with, who speaks about the Declaration of Independence, talking about the seeking freedom from British colonial rule, and the preamble right there saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Meanwhile, you start digging into the grievances, and it's the British won't let us further colonize more land, and they're stoking African slave rebellions against us. And him, a Native American theologian, is pointing out, look at this, this core hypocrisy in these foundational myths and documents. Coming from the context of the United States, Dr. Atalia Omer and James Thompson write about how Zionism is interrupting what should be an organic solidarity between Black communities in the U.S. and Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. Similarly, Dr. Marthy Momberg, a member of the leadership committee for the Cairo South Africa group, writes about how in recent years, the Israeli government has successfully been interrupting a natural solidarity between Africans and Palestinians by intentionally fostering deeper connections as a matter of foreign policy. Momberg also states that both Christianity and Zionism are imports to sub-Saharan Africa, but have been enculturated into African spirituality. I'm curious how you both see this happening in your specific contexts, or if you have other thoughts about this, Dad.
Yeah, I think I've read a little bit about what Dr. Momberg has written. And I think for me, the connection with Zionism in African-initiated churches comes in a different form, right? So it doesn't look like, particularly historically, like Christian Zionism looks today. So Zionism in African-initiated churches, as Momberg says, is based on that liberation theology we just heard a little bit about from Thandi, looking at a new Zion, a new place for liberated peoples who are trying to decenter mission Christianity and sort of form their own understandings of this new faith that they've received, but also grounding it in African spirituality. But we have seen in many nations in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in East Africa as well, as this connection Israel is forming with different nations and seeing how that would help their cause. I mean, it has happened in South Africa as well, the connection in the 1960s onwards with the apartheid government and obviously the funding of arms from Israel. So we see these different strategic moves being made by the state of Israel in order to perhaps create a counter PR to the genocide that has been happening and the overall oppression that's historically been happening since 1948. And so that I've seen in my specific context. Another thing I think I've seen a little bit more sinister is someone who's in a Pentecostal church, in Pentecostal circles. What I've seen in those circles is that there are links being made to their Christianity and showing us a sense of support, a sense of empathy on the side of Israel. So language like, it's just so hard, it's such a difficult thing to understand, and there are many sides to the story. And another thing that's being said, which is connection to Palestinians, but in a very weird and insidious way, where it's a connection that says, well, why are they killing Palestinians? They are Palestinian Christians. And so that in itself, that statement says that Palestinians of any other religion or faith orientation are not worth engaging. But if they are Palestinian Christians, then we should engage that more. And that for me is more sinister because it still communicates a ranking of people's lives, but using the Christian faith as the ranking. And so I think those are the two things that I've seen. A third is more anecdotal. It's the sense of funding or removal of funding by Jewish groups for certain projects and NGOs in South Africa. So we've seen those types of strategic moves within popular NGOs and popular projects between Jewish-funded companies.
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with a lot of what Ntando said. And I think I really appreciate Atalia Omer's and James Thompson's work on the idea of interrupting solidarities. I think that's a really interesting way to see it. And I think it also highlights, what Ntando said, the intentionality around it, of disrupting, the intentionality of winning support and how that looks. Because I think a lot of the time that it's not easy to see that intentionality and what's actually going on, because it's channels of money and funding that are not always easily seeable. They often operate kind of under the radar in various ways. And so I think we sometimes just look at this picture and are not sure what exactly exactly is going on, why there is so much support for Israel. But I think when we start to see it as a very intentional project of whether you want to see it as interrupting organic solidarities or, whatever it takes to kind of win friends around the world through whatever narratives can be employed and whatever resources can be mobilized. I think seeing it as an intentional project is really important in thinking about strategic ways to actually push back on that. And in South Africa, South Africa is interesting because of, I think, our very contested history and contested relationship with Israel and Palestine. So I think what Ntando mentioned of the apartheid government's links and very close and intimate relationship with apartheid Israel and the collaborations on weaponry and various kinds of profit-making things being one part of it, but then also the very close links between the South African liberation movement and the Palestinian liberation movement, and that being very layered and operating in various ways. And so I think these histories still come through in various ways today. So you still see the very strong support for the state of Israel from the descendants of the apartheid regime, but also it has been spread broader than that. But also you see the very strong solidarity still with Palestine, and I think that operates within the church as well. But definitely, I think that intentionality is also very evident here of Israel. I think many people know that pilgrimages is a significant way that this kind of support for Israel is built. And so that has been happening in South Africa. Not too long ago, a few months ago, some of our members of parliament went on a kind of secret trip. It was like we only found out about it when they came back to Israel, and they came back saying, oh, there's no apartheid in Israel. We were there. And that happens also with church leaders. So people will be like specific church leaders, I think, will be intentionally targeted, people who have significant influence. And I think there is a very sinister thing of very intentional targeting of Black churches. And I think, I know that Atalia writes about that in the US context, and I think definitely on the African continent and in South Africa, that is also happening. And I think particularly through these trips. But also we have a Christian political party here, the ACDP, African Christian Democratic Party, I think. And the leader of that party, his late daughter now, she actually passed away quite recently, but she was leading this movement and started this organization specifically trying to target young Black Christians to win them into support for the state of Israel. So there's very intentional targeting going on across the board. And I think that strategy is something that we need to recognize and make visible so that we don't just see it as this random thing. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of, in churches, people who wouldn't see themselves as Zionists, but who support Israel kind of because of a conflation between the biblical Israel and the state of Israel that has kind of gone unchecked and pushed back on. And I think that thing is a really important thing to address, because I think it's so easily mobilizable into something that's more nefarious and more intentional and active in support of Israel.
Yeah, this brings in something that I think is important to note, is that you mentioned intentionality of like the Israeli propaganda machine. And in the US right now, they have started a massive social media campaign where they're targeting specifically churches, mostly on the western coast of the United States. But if your phone tracks you, like going into one of the churches, it's going to start delivering like AI generated Israeli propaganda slop onto that person's phone, right? And it's just, I had the privilege of having a conversation with Hannah Mushabek from Interleague Press and Sim Kern, who's the author of Genocide Bad, the other day. And like, it's getting so weird. Like the internet was already weird, but like now it's getting so much more nefarious. And I think that sometimes people want to make the assumption that folks who are in some sort of way horrible, awful, ethical, theological framework, that somehow they are like unintelligent or like stupid. And when in reality, like they're very intentional, they are very smart. And unfortunately for a lot of us, they're very good at what they're doing. And so I think that that's something that people here in the United States should be aware of. And I wouldn't be surprised if this method of like the imperial boomerang were to crop up in other places across the world, doing the same sort of thing where like your geo tagging on your phone is going to mark you as someone that they're like, oh, we've lost the narrative. We're losing the narrative battle. We're going to start delivering stuff to this people's phone because we need to fix our PR. We need to get people back on our side. And so it's just, I don't have any solutions or answers for how to like solve the AI problem, but it's just crazy.
It's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is completely crazy. So I think because I come from a kind of education background, that's a kind of lens that I think with a lot of the time. And I feel like I will bring these together, but I think the way that churches are set up and the way that we practice our faith generally feeds into this completely. Because I think because of the hierarchies that are present within churches generally, the ways our pedagogies in churches. So Paulo Freire is one of my favorite thinkers, the Brazilian educator, and he talks about in traditional education, there's this kind of idea, deeply held belief, I guess, in terms of education of the teacher being the one who holds all this expertise and the students being these kind of blank slates or empty vessels. And so the work of teaching is to pour this wisdom or knowledge into these empty vessels. And I think many of our churches operate with exactly that mentality. It's certain people who hold the knowledge and other people simply receive the knowledge and are empty vessels. And I mean, that kind of socialization, I think, leaves us open to all kinds of this sort of thing. And so to me, it feels like a more fundamental question of how we see ourselves, how we see each other, what faith should be, who comes with the wisdom, who comes with the ability to think theologically, to do theology. Because I think if things are restructured in that way, where everyone's ability to do theology is recognized and churches become spaces where there's room for that kind of engagement and struggle and kind of reclaiming of faith by everyone, I don't think there would be this kind of space where, this AI slop can just be poured into people unquestioningly. And so for me, it feels like a fundamental flaw in how we think about our religion and our faith and our churches.
Just want to mention for our listeners who might be interested in this propaganda campaign, they can go to www.targetedchurches.com to learn more about that.
Thanks, Jesse. So moving on to sort of like, we're living in this sort of sea of like disinformation and bad theology and harmful, destructive narratives. And what now? Like, what do we do? How do we move forward? I think one offering is that Palestinian practical theologian Dr. Shadia Kubti has embarked on the project of developing a spiritual blueprint that differs from Christian Zionist theology in terms of a different theological vision for like South African Christians in particular. What might that look like? What kind of theology needs to take shape in Christian communities in South Africa in order to give clergy and lay people like something different than this damaging theology of Christian Zionism that not only harms people in Palestine, but also harms people in your own context of South Africa? What does this need to look like? Or another way to frame that is like, is there hope? Where is the hope? Where do you find the hope? And maybe for us doing this movement work related to liberating Palestine, are there like helpful things that happened to dismantle South African apartheid that we can take and learn from as we work to liberate all oppressed peoples around the planet? So just to recap that question, what does a new theology, different theology, better theology that is not Christian Zionism look like? And what are some pathways forward to get us out of these harmful theologies?
Yeah, great question. And Everyone should go follow Shadia's work because she's amazing. I think some of the questions that she's asking in her work around this are really important for us to be thinking about and grappling with. And she's particularly looking at connections between Palestinian liberation theology and she's based in Canada, Indigenous theologies there. And I think that is an important part of it. How have people in different spaces that have experienced settler-colonial histories and grappled with it, whether they've been successful or not, what are the tools and the theologies that people have used to liberate themselves or to create life and flourishing in these spaces of death and violence? And I think that is what I would say in South Africa, to look back at our histories of solidarity with other groups who've been oppressed. And I think now more than ever, we need to be doing that work of finding each other, forming relationships across these various kinds of borders, because that's what's happening on the other side. I think these oppressive powers are finding each other and consolidating their power in various ways. And if we're not doing the same with people who we're in solidarity with, I think we find ourselves in a very difficult position. So solidarities, and that's been so present in our various liberation movements. And then secondly, I think the kinds of theologies of resistance. So and I think Ntando as well, I'm particularly interested in South African Black theologies that have really, I think, alongside various other forms of liberation theology that have sought to reclaim Christianity and position God with the oppressed and repoliticize, I think, the Christian narrative and the gospel narrative, this narrative that has been kind of neutralized and depoliticized and individualized and spiritualized in various ways so as to make it basically useless to any of our movements for justice and liberation. But that work of reclaiming Jesus, repoliticizing his crucifixion and repoliticizing his work in the world, I think that has been done in our South African history and in various other histories. And I think there's a wealth of resources that we can draw from those movements. So I think a lot of the time it's not about reinventing the wheel, but about uncovering these histories that have often been covered up or marginalized in various ways.
Yeah. Thanks, Thandi. I mean, I would have to agree with everything you're saying, particularly around taking theological tools that we have in liberation ideologies and theologies that already exist. And I think just catching on to what you were saying around repoliticizing Jesus, I think one tool could be placing Jesus in exactly where Jesus was. I think spatializing the Bible, making it clear the ways in which power moved within the Bible, how power moved between peoples, how it even moved towards the Israelis and away from them, and what that means for our time today. And also placing Jesus's movements and how intentional they were and the words said during those movements into context as well. And so just really spatializing what we see in the Bible to make clear that it's not just simple movements, but that they said something. And that helps us to really outwork what it would mean to love God and love our neighbor. I think the second thing I would say with regards to a spiritual tool is really a collective embodied way of looking at people as the Imago Dei. I think just the notes that I've seen around Christian Zionism unfolding in South Africa, I really think some theological tools we could use is really engaging with that conceptual tool of the image of God, particularly in those who are of a different religious affiliation from us, and looking at a theology toward love that has a suspicious hermeneutic, so a suspicious way of reading the Bible, asking questions of what is happening, why is this happening, who is being oppressed and why, and what would it mean to love someone in relation to a Jesus who died for his friends. And so I want to connect with what Thandi is saying, looking at liberation theologies which have suspicious readings of oppressive narratives in the Bible, as well as readings toward love, toward humanizing all people, regardless of who they are. And also just placing Jesus exactly where he was and not simply creating images of Jesus, because that's how we got here.
No, I think that this thread of Imago Dei has been a connective tissue between all of our episodes so far. Almost everybody is if we just did what the Bible said and loved each other and saw the humanity in each other, we would be in a more wholesome, loving environment. And so I really think that that's so important because it specifies what is happening right now with Palestine and the dehumanization, but it also allows us to connect all of these other liberation struggles, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening with trans people in the United States, Indigenous land right back across the globe. Like, it really allows us to see the interconnectedness of all of these struggles. Ntando, I'm wondering if you can say a bit more about what you mean about like spatializing the Bible and, making sure that we socially locate the Jesus of the Bible and the theology of the Bible with where it was and then the impact of that on the here and now.
Yeah, sure. I think what I mean by spatializing is really locating where people are in each of the stories and what that actually means. Because as I've gone on and studied, space and where we are not incidental or coincidental, that they serve a particular purpose. They also tell us who is oppressed and who is not, and who has power and who does not. I think I'll use perhaps Jesus's movements through his ministry as an example, looking at how in the Gospels, when Jesus moves through spaces which have the socially removed, the weak, the oppressed, how he creates narratives around the kingdom and hope. But when moving into spaces of power like Jerusalem, is speaking around that power and how that power seems to have blinded those whom God called towards the ultimate call of love. And so looking at that spatially would mean, okay, so he's moved into a particular space and said something to a specific people on the outskirts of power, and yet says something else to power. What does that mean for us today? I think it helps us read the Bible in a more expansive way, but also helps us to locate those of power and those who are oppressed within the biblical narratives, and helps us then to sort of decenter what Thandi was telling us around the church theology, that it's just simply a story of the life and the death and the resurrection, but actually there are powers at play here that move Jesus into that death. And so seeing them might help us see how they operate now today, because they've just shifted names and places, but power remains the same. And so how do we use those narratives in a liberating way?
I was here looking for a quote from Mitri Raheb that I wanted to, this whole conversation, I think, Ntando, you put it so beautifully, of putting Jesus back in the land. And one, it reminds me of Palestinian theology and just Palestinian life in general when they talk about the fifth gospel being the land and how integral and grounded it is to so much of their spirituality. And this reminds me of a quote from Dr. Raheb, who says, "For Palestinians, including the Palestinian Christian community, Palestine is a real land with real people. It is our homeland, the land of our ancestors. For Christians in the West, Palestine is an imagined land, a land that they know mainly from the Bible, and it has little, if anything, to do with the real Palestine." And so what you were sharing reminded me so much of that quote of these theological imaginings that we draw from the text and construct, and then through the colonial force, through the power, impose that upon a land, to hell with the actual consequences for the real people and the real histories living there.
I'm just going to offer something quick. When I asked Mitri this question, I talked about the fifth gospel. I wanted him to extrapolate on this, and he rightly corrected me that Palestine is the first gospel, not the fifth. I just want to hold that as we move forward.
So this idea of the first gospel, or also the living stones metaphor, I think resonates very much with, in Black theology, this kind of recognition of the Black oppressed body as the first sacred text, that all other sacred texts should be read through. And I think that also speaks back to what Ntando was saying about the Imago Dei and seeing God in every person, because until we're recognizing all people as perhaps the most important sacred text, then I think the Bible actually loses its sacredness in many ways. I think the Bible has been used for many agendas and many things, and I think it has to be read in conversation with the people that we are inhabiting this earth with. It has to be read in conversation with the earth itself. I think all of these things must form part of this thing that we see as our sacred text.
The librarian in me must offer a resource here. I think that Kelly Brown Douglas's book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, does a really good job at addressing just what Thandi was talking about.
Before I say my last final thank yous and goodbyes, actually, I was really intrigued by, and I know it's probably been discussed quite a lot, but having you here, and I recently heard you give a recording or a talk about church versus state theology. And I just was wondering if you could just give this American audience a little bit of background into the difference between those two. Because even in our work, we're talking in the work of Christian Zionism, we talk about like what we might call the classic dispensationalist, conservative Christian Zionism, and also liberal Christian Zionism in a sense. And it very much kind of reminded me of this parallel. Maybe, I don't know your context, the South African context as much, but I'm wondering if you can help elaborate on that.
Happily, but this is a very dangerous question to ask me because I'm such a Kairos document nerd. So once you get me started talking about this, I can go on for a long time. So I will try and keep it short. But in brief, so the Kairos document was a document that was written in 1985 at a time where a state of emergency had just been instituted by the apartheid state. And so there were severe levels of repression, even more so than what had been happening before. And so the Kairos document was kind of birthed out of this engagement with the context and particularly thinking about the church in that context and the role that the church and its theologies were playing in that context. So one of the most, I think, significant offerings that it provided was this, firstly, just the idea of the church and theology as a site of struggle. So this idea that there's not one theology, but there's many theologies operating on the South African church landscape, and these theologies are doing multiple things. And then the document went on to kind of go into what these different theologies that they were seeing were doing on the landscape. So as you say, in terms of the two theologies that they identified that they saw were perpetuating the apartheid status quo in different ways were, as you say, state theology and church theology. So state theology essentially was like the overt use of theology and scripture to justify the apartheid status quo. So this kind of racial hierarchy and state of repression. And this was really the theology that was embodied by the Dutch Reformed Church, which was the church of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, essentially, that kind of provided the theological justification for apartheid. So it was this very overt justification that they called state theology. And then church theology, I think, is interesting and I think, maybe would be akin to the liberal Zionism that you're talking about. Because in essence, it claims to be against the injustice of apartheid. But because it doesn't do a deep social or political analysis and doesn't recognize the systems and the structures that are actually at play producing the injustices that are seen, it kind of plasters over them with these kind of nice sounding, easy solutions, which don't actually address the problem, which don't address the root of what's going on. So one example is that church theology would talk about reconciliation as the solution to apartheid. So if all races just reconcile and get along, then this thing will be solved. But of course, that doesn't recognize this entire machinery that is producing this racialized injustice and oppression that is present. So that's the state and church theology. And I'm actually working on something now which is trying to develop that into an analytical framework that can be really used to analyze the ways that theologies are operating. And I'm doing a case study where I'm analyzing some media articles to see how Christian Zionism, how it can help us to analyze and provide a framework to look at how Christian Zionism operates in the South African context. So,
Thank you both again for giving your time and your expertise to this important, incredible conversation today. Thank you so much for being here. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. Next time, we'll be back to talk about Christian Zionist expressions within the Black church in the United States.
Our original music, The Path Forward, was written and produced by Carl St. Lucie and Danny Fry, featuring sampled speech by Reverend Dr. Munter Isaac. ISCZ is a project of Friends of Sabeel North America, a nonprofit Christian ecumenical organization seeking justice and peace in the Holy Land through education, advocacy, and nonviolent action. To learn more about ISCZ and to donate to our important and critical work, please visit us at studychristianzionism.org. Until next time, thank you so much.